Economic Development Canada for our final speaker. And Joanne is here. So Joanne Pollock is the Director General of Business Innovation and Community Development. And she's going to come and introduce our final breakfast speaker this morning.
Hello, everyone. It's my honor to introduce our last speaker, Jason Ribeiro. And, you know, Jason is a well-known economic development leader. He's a public affairs commentator, a community advocate. I checked his Twitter feed just before I came on here. He has 10,300 followers. I should say 10,301 because I just added myself to that list. So he is definitely a thought leader in this area, and very pleased that he's able to share his insights with us today to help position Alberta for the future. Jason, over to you.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much to Joanne and my friends at Prairie Scan for that very warm introduction. What a few days we've had here in Kananaskis. And I would be remiss if I didn't for a moment pause and thank and ask you all to join me in a round of applause for Leanne and the organizers, the sponsors, the hotel and event staff, all of these folks responsible for bringing this community back together again, so bravo. You know, closing a conference is an interesting endeavor. I've done this a handful of times before, and you become acutely aware that after days of sessions and dinners and late nights for some and hurried calls and stairwells back to the office or back home, that I am one of the last people standing in the way of folks grabbing a bite, hitting the road, going home to relax, checking out, or throwing on a robe and heading over to the Nordic Spa. And that's not even to mention that I followed Todd Hirsch. So this is all a tall order. But I can tell you a few things up front to perhaps put you at a bit of ease. First, I'm not going over my time. So let's get that off the table. Not always a given in the closing keynote, in my experience. Second, it is not my intention to summarize all that we've discussed and learned over the last few days. You were here. You know that stuff already. So we can mark an X next to that. My objectives this morning are actually pretty humble, and I have a rationale as to why. Most of us in this room, including myself, come to the work of economic development from someplace else. For me, it was management consulting and board governance and research. For some, it is through elected office and public service. For others, it is after deep levels of industry or nonprofit experience. And it is that professional diversity that enables us to serve our communities in a variety of critically important ways. So, after years of making our bones in different fields and gaining expertise, we're often not in search of more stats and figures at these events unless they're Todd Hirsch's. They're informative, and we certainly need them to do our jobs well, but it's not often what we search for. More information. So then what do we search for as we continue to do the work of economic development? If you're like me, it's that single passage you end up highlighting in a book that you randomly get a chance to read on that one vacation. It's that moment in a film where a character delivers a line that doesn't just change the course of the movie, but has changed something within you. New ideas. Not overly simplistic, tidy answers to complex problems, but new and simple ideas at the right time can give us new perspective on the work that we're doing. And if you leave this talk, or not even this talk, but this conference, with just a couple of those moments, a couple of those ideas that separate noise from signal, you will be leaving with absolute true value. Of that, I have no doubt. That's my objective this morning. No more, no less. You know, a few moments ago, I used a word, and it's a word that doesn't typically get used organically in conversation, and certainly not in the way that I've used it on the screen behind me. Enabling. Enabling Alberta. Over the years, the prevalence of several crisis periods in our province, or even just as a result of routine updates to strategies, they've all led us to envision what the future of this province could be. And with that comes an onslaught of consultations and research and roundtables to build a quote-unquote better Alberta, a quote-unquote stronger Alberta, the quote-unquote next Alberta. And these efforts persist to this very day, and they're bolstered by good work and carried out by folks that are whip-smart and have noble intentions. But they're also sometimes underpinned by certain assumptions about the world, the economy, and the future, as Todd pointed out, that we must always question. If the future is indeed unknown, if the future is indeed unpredictable and complex, is our work as economic developers to define with conviction what that better, that stronger, that next is, and then carry out work to push us there? Or is it perhaps something different? Can we instead facilitate and enable change that pulls in new possibilities, rather than trying to push and direct our economy towards a predetermined end state that very rarely ends up being evidenced in practice? That's the tension I want us to explore over the next 30 minutes or so. And in doing so, I'm going to talk about three things with you. Full warning, two of them are kind of scary. One is not. The first of the scaries is that for a moment, I'm going to turn you all into complexity thinkers, complexity scientists. Just the sheer mention of the word complexity when I bring it up in certain rooms terrifies some folks. I'll even put myself in that position the first few times I heard it. Complicated, I can deal with, but complexity sounds like a whole different kettle of fish. Don't worry, no coursework or lab coats will be required, but there is a trade-off. No certificates or credits will be granted either. But we will go on a bit of a journey this morning to explore how researchers and thought leaders in this field, including myself, view the world we're attempting to shape and respond to. And that's in the hopes that perhaps some of you, not all, but some of you will adopt a few of these perspectives in your economic development work moving forward and find them useful. The second of the scaries, as I'm calling them, is to briefly walk through the perils and the costs of ignoring complexity, pretending it doesn't exist, and believing the fiction that we can command and control and administrate our way to prosperous communities. The third, which is much more inspiring, Leanne just wiped her brow like, okay, is that some researchers and business leaders have been wrestling with this complexity question for some time and offer us some good, solid, evidence-based strategies to guide the economic development work that lies ahead. And so I have 4 rules to leave you with, informed by not only my own research, but also the leading minds at General Motors, the leading minds at organizations like the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, and even a few Alberta-based companies that are being utilized to confront complexity head-on and enable organizations to balance the need to produce results with the need the critical need to innovate. And the goal in putting all of these things together in the end is that you return to your organizations more comfortable operating in the unknown, in complexity. It's not easy. Because the global innovation economy has already shown us that those who are more comfortable taking risks, those who are more comfortable being tolerant of failure, and those who are being given the opportunity to correct previous mistakes and try again will be rewarded. And those who do not will not. Alberta's advantage in the historical sense is indeed still strong, as is our entrepreneurial spirit. But at a time of rising accountability, declining trust, and increased competition for investment and scarce resources, our ability as economic developers to be on the leading edge will determine whether we are actually able to deliver outcomes for investors and citizens into the future. So let's parse out for a moment some of the essential information we're going to need to be comfortable with if we're going to operate in complexity. The first, my fellow scientists, is being able to tell the difference between something that is complicated and something that is complex, so you know how to respond to it when you see it. This is one of the most commonly made errors, not just in economic development, but in business, in the public sector, you name it. So let's speak outside of the economic development context for a moment. An example of something complicated would be the vehicle you drove to Kananaskis in. It's certainly got a lot of component parts. The system that operates the vehicle is quite sophisticated and complicated. But if I added a part to it, if I replaced a fender, or I was in a very, Fast and Furious mood and added a racing stripe, it wouldn't change the nature of the glass in the windows. It wouldn't change the nature of the fabric in the seats. The vehicle's components still stay the same. That's complicated, in that yellow bar right there. Now, an example of something complex would be, say, a cake. And I was going to put a picture of a cake up, but I thought people would be salivating, we would go back, there wouldn't be cake, it would be a whole mess, and I would blame Leanne. So I thought it best to avoid that. But let's say for a moment that a cake is an example of something that is complex. Because as I'm making a cake and I am adding ingredients, it is changing all of the others to produce something new. And I can't undo that process to go back to having intact eggs and a bag of flour and a lob of butter. And the first time these ingredients were ever put together, think about this. The first time someone, probably through experimentation, put these ingredients together, no one really knew what it would produce. It generated something unpredictable and novel. That's complexity. It takes into account that dynamic of interactivity and change in the way that the car and its components does not. So now let's get off of cake and cars and bring it back to economic development. An example of a complicated request that could appear on your desk is, let's say, launching a new resettlement program for newcomers in rural Alberta. Certainly complicated, requires a lot of coordination in terms of training and referrals and paperwork and getting other systems and orders of government to talk to one another. Your response in this case would be largely administrative and orderly. You can think through it right now, what you would do on day one. This is what we do. And your next steps would be fairly straightforward in terms of getting agreement from the impacted parties, because they would hear it and it would make pretty good common sense if you knew what you were doing. But an example of a complex problem would be being charged with preparing young people in your town for jobs that do not exist yet, but will in the near future. That is a multi-dimensional talent retention and skill development behemoth of a problem. and you cannot administrate your way through that. That is a problem that no one organization can solve on its own. And that is increasingly becoming the types of problems our communities are faced with and are reliant on us as economic developers and our partners and our orders of government to help with. So once a complex problem darks in your door, of your agency, of your community, what impact should it have at a high level on the way that you work through it with your stakeholders? Well, in every initiative we tackle, we should always be monitoring the balance between the need to produce expected outcomes or results and the need to produce innovation for our constituents. And the stakeholders that are looking for these things are not often the same. Sometimes the expected outcomes are driven by our political counterparts. They're driven by our organization's board. And sometimes the need to innovate is just based on the outcome needed from citizens. And although those two functions are pretty similar, they can and often should come into conflict. The need to be innovative may introduce more risk, may expand the number of outside partners you have to rely on and bring in, but being laser focused solely on the need for your organization to produce regularly expected results could seriously inhibit your ability to see future opportunities for change, to drive even more innovative and thoughtful and impactful outcomes, and adequately deal with very complex challenges. Ideally, adaptive leaders are the ones who push that balance. They create tension and conflict in an organization and drive everyone, a coalition of the willing, towards new emergent possibilities. And I'll go more into this later, but I want to really harp on that area of tension right there. This is creating an adaptive space in our economic development organizations. This is creating an adaptive space in our communities where we can try, where we can experiment, where we can talk straight to one another about the challenges, that we don't have to be concerned about, buffering conflict and, rolling it under a rug. This is where the most critical innovative decisions happen, in that tension. And I'll get into more of how it can enable adaptivity in a moment. Now, it's difficult to say this now because, as Todd mentioned, we're still in the midst of the global health pandemic. Other areas of our world are getting hit a lot harder than us right now. But like anything, there are silver linings, upsides, lessons, and even beauty to be found amongst the turmoil. Roses between the thorns. And the same can even be said for the atrocities being committed in Ukraine, something I know we discussed at our dinner table last night, as I'm sure many of you did as well. Amidst all the pain and bloodshed and conflict, we are seeing new leaders claiming the world stage and building a new era of trust, reinvigorating alliances that remained dormant. My favorite sort of quip about the G7 is the title of it being called the G0, where everyone is sort of afraid to lead. Amongst rubble in hollowed out subway stations and parks, Ukrainian musicians are returning to their communities to play Bach and Vivaldi and folk songs for the rest of the world. One of the positive things researchers noted empirically during COVID-19, amidst all the pain and all the complexity, was that there was a near 20% increase in those who discovered or rediscovered nature and outdoor recreation. I know for our family, those daily walks and weekend hikes were an injection of perspective, and I suspect for many of you it likely had a similar effect. The ability for a moment to escape from the Zoom calls and to think about and prioritize what is most important to you and your families. The opportunity to be still. And while understanding nature is also one of the ways we can begin to understand complexity in addition to the economy, as Todd mentioned earlier. Nature can be used to get through some of the mumbo jumbo related to this complexity stuff. And despite the fact that much of our focus as a field has turned to technology as of late, particularly in our urban centers, perhaps less so in other communities, nature is actually one of the biggest inspirations of disruptive technology and is a theme I'm going to return often to in this talk. I'll read it out for those who can't see it in a moment. Every day, we perform routine tasks at our homes, at our jobs, that we don't even have to think of. It's only natural to assume that over time, if you've done it once, you've done it 1,000 times the exact same way, and that each time, the outcome will be the same. But that's not actually the case. Though familiar, every single instance has been different. And in roughly 500 BC, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus wrote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." Everything we need to understand about change, about innovation, big and small in our communities, and complexity is contained within that quote. No matter how many times I've put my feet into the Bow River, the circumstances are dynamic, they're unpredictable, and completely new. And that's the world of today, and frankly, that's the way the world has always been. And we are just catching up to that reality now. And the reason we in our field need to understand this is because over time, more and more of our industry partners have begun to understand this as well. What may be true at 9 p.m. when we power down the phones may not be true at 6 a.m. when you pick it back up. And we need to be okay with that. The program we ran a year ago was a fantastic success, but it may be a total failure this year if we fail to take into account new information and adapt. Over the past decade, we've seen huge adoption of complexity thinking in healthcare and life sciences, IT, transportation and logistics, and sectors dealing with large, complex issues, like, for example, the energy transition. But it has been slow to take hold in economic development spheres, despite my fervent belief that it is more relevant to this community than to many others. The complexity of nature is shaping the technology that is disrupting the global economy, and it is us who will need to deal with the consequences with our communities. The river, for instance, draws many parallels to modern blockchain. Like a river, blockchain continues its course forward without a centralized force needed to generate movement. The river and the chain are always flowing, self-sustained. We can track its shift in every direction through observation. And just as the water of the river called people to meet and settle for centuries, blockchain is now bringing together people and information and generating new possibilities. Hope you haven't had more breakfast. Here's another. It's nature. It's beautiful. Here's another example of complexity in action, and frankly, the gold standard for collaboration, and actually the kind of partnering that Jean talked about so eloquently in her breakfast session yesterday. It's the classic case of the sum being greater than the parts, and the importance of forging deep social connections in the face of very real threats. Consider the problems these poor suckers face. You got intense heat. You got predators looking to sweep them up at every moment, having to forage constantly for food, and being dependent on an entire colony of 10,000 ants moving in unison as a whole, constantly adapting to meet the needs of its environment quickly and efficiently. No single ant can get this done on its own. And it reminded me of the discussions I've had with a few of you over the past few days. Without fault, when I asked folks what was the best benefit of the conference, it's the relationships. Those hallway conversations about how we can support one another. Communication is a critical component of leading in complexity, and these ants are constantly taking the temperature of one another, knowing who's on first and who's on second, and never losing sight of their central goal: survival. And now scientists and company leaders are looking at how these ants function efficiently in colonies and how that can frame solutions to some of the most vexing logistical problems the globe is facing. How many of you in the room have heard of the company Adibotics? Raise your hand. I'll tell you a little bit about them. No greater example of nature inspiring someone to lead through complexity than Adibotics. So that's Scott Gravel at Adibotics headquarters in Northeast Calgary. And he was actually, as a manufacturing worker, watching a nature documentary years ago. And he became fascinated by the movements of these leaf cutter ants who would build their colonies vertically underground. And what he learned by leaning into the complexity was that he could design a similar colony structure for fulfillment that utilized robotic shuttles to use both horizontal and vertical space, reducing a company's warehouse needs by 85%. It's an Alberta story. It's a Calgary story. And now they're able to build smaller and closer to customers as a result, and have won countless awards. I know WD has graciously funded them as well in their round. And if adaptive thinking is having this kind of transformative impact in the sector, we definitely need to be aware of it, and we definitely need to follow suit in our own work. And by the way, this company has been named to every sort of innovation list you can think of. Fast Company's top 50, CNBC's top 50, something top 50, and they're not 50th. They're higher up there, and I believe even Time Magazine. The final example of leading in complexity I've used here from nature is the flocking behavior of birds. This is something that we can see regularly, and what's astonishing is that these birds aren't taught to fly together. Many of them don't have any past experience in flying with one another, yet they're capable of complex collaboration and communication and course corrections that keep them safe and headed towards their destination. If only humans collaborating together was that easy. But what looks complex to our eyes is actually held together by three simple rules that are shared amongst all the members, all the birds that you're seeing in that ecosystem. The first is cohesion. Each bird is actually positioning itself within the center of its two neighbors, without fail. That's rule number one. Number two, alignment. Each bird takes note of the direction their neighbor is flying in and mirrors it. That's why it's not just one straight line. The groups are able to take the social cue from the neighbors beside them. And then the third is the most obvious, separation. Each bird recognizes that even if it gets crowded, they keep a boundary between their neighbors to avoid hitting one another. Simple shared rules are critical to navigating complexity, especially when working across sectors with other partners. You know, as it applies to Alberta and some of our competitors, much of my doctoral work is on cross-sector partnerships, largely in the United States. And the US has been far more aggressive than Canada in operating like this. The ability to define very vexing, complex problems and bring together partners with disparate value propositions, both monetarily, socially, and environmentally, to do what needs to be done in whatever way they can to reach that goal is astounding when you compare the scale to what's happening in Canada. And one of the specific realms that I look at is education, specifically focusing on public education. In communities you would never think of, you see cradle-to-grave efforts where communities that include faith leaders, small businesses like barbershops, after-school programs, public schools, entrepreneurs are all coming together to ensure the kids in their local community, from the moment they're born to the moment they die, are taken care of by the community. It sounds almost utopian, but it is happening in communities in rural and urban United States, and it has been happening for decades. underpinned by simple rules that say if I can offer one area of support, that is what I can do to this broader collective. And if everyone knows their part, if everyone knows where their neighbor is, we'll be okay. You know, there are nationwide networks now supporting experiential learning. And this is not just for the elite of the elite. There are lotteries now for the most vulnerable students in cities like New York to give them every fair chance and shake at an internship at a white-collar firm, the IBMs headquartered in New York. Companies are risking private capital in these types of activities, originally as corporate social responsibility, but now they understand that they're building capacity for their talent pipelines down the line. All of these collaborations are underpinned by simple rules, collaboration, everyone knowing their position, everyone knowing the goal, and working like hell to achieve it. And on occasion, they fall short, but their tolerance for failure is so much greater than what we're seeing in our country and in our province. And the learning that they're getting from those failures, from falling short, is only bolstering their efforts moving forward. So in this case, researchers spent 6 years simulating the patterns of the birds that you just saw, and then actually attached GPS devices to determine if they could reproduce those aerial formations that you saw with autonomous drones. Now for drones, mastering the synchronized communication and automated flight is not where it needs to be, but eventually it will, where they automatically communicate with one another and course correct in the airspace above us. That photo shows 30 quadcopters about to fly in sync after they were programmed to mimic the flight of that flock of birds. So to recap, as you are all now complexity scientists, number one, we know the difference between complicated tasks that require administrative solutions and complex problems that require adaptive solutions. That ability to determine one and the other is critically important in how you structure your work in your communities, be they rural or urban. Two, we know that to do economic development work effectively, the balance between producing results and needing to innovate needs to be constantly tested. We cannot let the notion of our province's entrepreneurial spirit fade into mythos. It must be lived up to. That means we cannot remain as risk averse as we've been politically and policy wise, because at the end of the year, in any community, that report card is getting printed no matter what. And we need to look at our constituents and our partners and friends in the whites of their eyes and own what we got done and own what we didn't. So we might as well do the things that we believe in to our core, even if it means taking more risk up front, if it helps us deliver more in the end. That's the conversation we need to be having in every community in this province, openly and transparently. Three, we know that we are playing catch-up, catching up to Heraclitus, 500 BC, catching up to the birds, and catching up to our partners at the leading edge of industry here in this home province and abroad. And lastly, and what I will address in a moment, is that it is our time to play the role that I believe we are meant to play in this province as economic developers. The role only we can. And that is the enabling role that is going to foster forward progress and adaptivity and emergence for Alberta. Now, before I get into the 4 simple rules that can underpin that work, and I know for many of you, you probably already are, I thought it prudent to examine the challenges and costs of ignoring complexity. You know, early in my career, I did a lot of research on public sector spending and the efficacy behind some of those efforts, specifically in school boards in Ontario related to technology and IT. And for those of you who don't know, Ontario has some of the largest public school districts in the world. So when they purchase something, it is a multi-million-dollar enterprise-level purchase that we as taxpayers, at least I used to be a taxpayer in Ontario, don't really know that much about. It's much more favorable tax conditions here, by the way. And I did a study on the spending that impacted 1 million students in Alberta, and what I found was that those that were responsible for IT were not talking to those who were responsible for learning. Enterprise decisions were being made based on the CIO's previous brand loyalty on a whim or a blog that they had read. The infrastructure needs and demands of the schools weren't considered before they purchased the devices that were going to be used in those systems. And the reason I bring this up is because in every one of those instances, the unknown was not ever considered. All they knew in front of them was what they needed to do and to produce results, to buy technology because that was the thing to do. And they did their job. And the outcomes were horrendous. Not only were they not aligned with best research, best evidence, best practices on what kids need in their classroom, be they Chromebooks or iPads, they didn't consider the teachers' capabilities to teach in this new environment. They didn't consider whether the Wi-Fi needed to be upgraded. They didn't consider the security of the devices that they had just purchased, which led to thousands of them being stolen. If you can look up Texas, they had thousands of brand new iPads stolen because they hadn't considered how to lock them up. This is what can happen when you don't consider the complexity of how might the people that I'm hoping to help respond to the things that I'm spending money on. And the metaphor that I'm going to bring up, and it's funny that Todd mentioned something similar about reading a book, but not necessarily being sold on everything in the book. This is an exact example of that. The metaphor that I want you guys to explore as you consider these 4 rules I'm about to present is the metaphor of being a gardener or a designer in the economic development work that you do. And it's a metaphor that was forwarded in a book by an economist from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Brian Lee Crowley, right-leaning, more conservative economist and pundit. And he used that metaphor, that comparison, to describe more conservative political leaders and more progressive ones. And I don't buy that application, by the way. It's one of the things I struggle with in the book. But what I do think is very interesting is the example that he came up with to explicate it. So imagine that he was having a conversation with a colleague about a new post-secondary institution that was going to be built. And everyone was excited. They had hired a brilliant design firm that did this work, and they went all out. They designed fountains and beautiful walkways and landscapes and hedges and mazes and all these kinds of things for this post-secondary institution for the community that had been needing one for some time. It looked like Harry Potter, whatever Harry Potter goes to school. Hogwarts, that's it. Not a big Harry Potter fan. That's what it looked like. And what they hadn't considered is that once the ribbon cutting had happened and once the students were finally able to step foot on that grass, they saw how students interacted with the space. And the students weren't using the paved walkways. They found it more efficient to get to their classes by cutting across the hedges. They didn't consider that some people living in the residence actually needed to go by a lot of the beautiful foliage with their bicycles and ran up too close to it, damaging it. And within a few weeks, they were constantly re-upping their landscaping bill over and over and over again because they hadn't considered the people that they were going to serve. They designed a solution outright in an office and executed on it because it was easy to do. Don't be a designer. Be a gardener. The Gardner example was another post-secondary institution that had learned from that mistake. And rather than go all Harry Potter on this new post-secondary that they were building, they decided to build the building for the function that the students needed to use it in and not complete the landscaping yet, but to wait for new information of how the students on day 1 were going to interact on day 7, on day 15, and day 20. And once they found the mobility patterns of students going to classes and going to their residences and going out to get a bite to eat and coming back, then they laid the landscaping and mapped it to exactly what was needed. They took in new information. They waited. They had tough conversations about when was the right time, what was the information they needed. They got everyone on board with that decision, and they created an adaptive space to have that conversation. That is the gardener's approach that can avoid high costs and negative outcomes. So very quickly, first 4 rules, let's go. Number 1, it is the responsibility of economic developers in your institutions to create an adaptive space. And I'll go back to that original diagram I had up. How you do this administratively doesn't actually matter. It can be a stand-up meeting, it could be a Slack channel, but our organizations and our departments must have trusted space with our colleagues to inject tension and conflict and questions, where we debate the need to produce results and the need to innovate in response to a complex challenge. And look, this is easier said than done. The organizations that do this well in the yellow area, that adaptive space, are incredibly high performing and have high levels of trust, not only within but across their organizations, with their counterparts in elected office and corporate sponsors and their board. In environments where there isn't trust, this complexity can become chaos faster than you could think. And I get it. As humans today, this can be difficult. We want to soften and smoothen out some of this tension, even when the feedback is credible, but slightly critical. But as we know from our entrepreneurs in our communities, they're not striking 3 different committees to assess how they feel about a product or a program. They're getting into scrums, they're going out for a beer, and they're leaving with a direction because they had those tough conversations and they trusted one another to have it in the first place. As economic developers who are managing competing interests, many competing interests, we need to support one another as we continue to have tough and necessary conversations in our communities. Now, once that tension has been injected, we need to then, number 2 rule, and I'll go back to that slide, is facilitate informal networks to connect one another to those ideas that we've generated. Once that tension has been injected and our assumptions have been tested, no one is better positioned to facilitate informal networks from across the spectrum in our communities to connect people to ideas than economic developers. Our network is our strength. Our ability to convene people, especially informally, who are really driven by the work, not the hierarchy, not the structure, is unmatched in my opinion. This is the work that a gardener would do, from the bottom up, cultivating instead of engineering. We should all aspire to be gardeners in our work, planting, growing, appreciating the results, and building something that will thrive in whatever political or social or cultural soil that we work in. The next rule, number 3, for enabling is to inspect and adapt. Our goal, your goal, should not be to be beholden or slavish to a plan if it isn't working for you or your communities. Embrace the reality that our problems are unique, unpredictable, involving, and invisible, and this is why being agile and flexible is so important. Think about how different the conversation is about energy security around the world once a despot made a single choice to break every international norm conceivable. Could you fathom someone refusing to take in that new information into account during their work for the rest of the year and pretending as if it didn't happen because they had a plan that was created beforehand? No. Our community is no different, and that's something we need to work with all stakeholders to ensure they understand as well. And finally, we need to relinquish control. And this is very hard as well. If you want to change things, you need to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Some are going to thrive, some are not. And we can't determine in advance with a crystal ball what will work and what won't. But in general, what we want in our communities is not that formally designed garden with the fountains and the hedges. What we want is this vast meadow of different things that we couldn't have even imagined when we started to garden in the first place. If you over-constrain the system with bureaucracy, with command and control, with expectations of what you're going to find even before you do the work, it will constrain the benefits from emerging. The enabling work that we are charged with is focused on enabling, spread, and adoption. Knowing when that adaptive space for tension and conflict is needed, and working to open it up with the stakeholders that matter. Taking down walls of resistance and creating the opportunity for people to connect around shared purpose and accomplish something for mutual benefit. That is emergence. And so, just to close, I want to pose a question to all of you, all of us. If not you, then who? If not us, then who? Who is going to do this work? Who is better positioned to do this challenging work, to hit complexity square between the eyes? You know, former President Obama used to have a saying that we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And I feel absolutely the same about this. And I say that not just to the young faces in the room and the next gen of this field in this province, but to our mentors who are here as well. I still include myself in this community. For years, I was a distant supporter of economic development through research, through boards that I would sit on that had an economic mandate, and I had the privilege and honor of serving for Calgary Economic Development for 2 years. And that experience, not just within our own community and our organization, but to connect with many of you, was the privilege of a lifetime. And it exposed me to a community and the value of the work ahead for this community. The IEDC, the professional body that's responsible for economic developers around the world, affirms our unique positioning as the brokers, the enablers that are going to carry this complex work forward. Economic development is a behemoth, and I don't care if we're talking about a small rural town in this province or a large metropolitan city. No matter how you shake it, it's a behemoth. And the reason why is that no town or city is immune from the effects of a global economy. As much as our focus during the pandemic turned inward to buy local campaigns and local training efforts and the bonds that we could reach out and touch or mime touching at a distance, complexity is coming at us from all angles, and we need to be ready to confront it. To return to the beginning of this talk for a brief moment, I mentioned the power of simple ideas, that a new perspective at the right time can change everything. This was that idea for me. Adapt or die. It was a line, a throwaway line that Brad Pitt said in the movie Moneyball. It was based on a true story about a baseball team, the Oakland A's, out of nowhere, who used complexity thinking and statistical analysis to prove every doubter wrong and go on the most historic run in Major League history with the lowest costing roster in the league. And it was this throwaway line in a movie randomly that helped me understand how we need to be thinking in this province and this country when the stakes are this high. It can be this simple. So if you're an investment attractor or working in that field, if you are someone who is helping retrain our workforce, if you are a student curious about the work of economic development, now is our time. Now is our time to enable the critical work ahead. And our approach needs to be trusted. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be credible. I hope to have given you a few of those tools today. I'm honored to have shared the past few days with you, and I'm honored to call myself a part of this community. Thank you very much.